Welcome to the future of Israel and the Jewish people. This show is dedicated to reading the Hebrew Scriptures. If God did tremendous miracles in the past, and He said He was going to do tremendous miracles at the end of the age, we need to know what they are. So we're studying the book of Genesis to see the history of the formulation of the nation of Israel. It was God's plan. We're not going to preach or teach to you. We're going to ask you to research with us. Take out your Hebrew Scriptures and follow along. We're going to be in chapter 39 of Genesis, the first book. For Gentiles, that's your Old Testament. It's not obsolete. It's just preceded the New Testament. And if you're a Muslim, download an app, free, on the web page, and you'll be able to follow along and see what the Word of God 4,000 years ago said. All right, Joseph gets sold into slavery. He's taken to Egypt. His brothers hated him. His father loved him. Sounds like some of our lives. Well, that's human nature. What can I tell you? So I'm reading from verse 1. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian, who was one of Pharaoh's officers, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. Doesn't mention how much they sold him to. The Lord was with Joseph, and he prospered. That's the important thing. When God's with you, you prosper no matter where you are. And he lived in the house of the Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes, and because of his attention, Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and his entire trusted him for the care of everything he owned. That's a pretty important job. I mean, this was not somebody who just needed a maid. I mean, he put him in charge like a butler would be in an estate. He ordered, he sold, he gave orders, he directed, he checked on people. Okay? So Joseph finds favor now with his master. Remember, he's a slave. Okay? And this is what it says. From that time on, he put him in charge of his household and all that he owned. The Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. Very important. The blessings of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had. Very much like when Jacob was with his father-in-law. Both in the house and in the field. Okay? So he left Joseph in care everything he had, and Joseph was in charge. He didn't concern himself with anything except food to eat. That's amazing. The level of trust. When you have integrity, that should allow people to trust you. Now Joseph was well built and handsome, and after a while, his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, "Come to bed with me." So the Egyptian woman is propositioning him. But he refused. "With me in charge," he told her, "my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns, he has entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife." Now, when you have to remind somebody that they're married and that they're out of order, it's time to get out of this place. But he's a slave. He can't leave. Okay? Now then, can I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? Now it's getting a little bit more touchy. Okay? He's not only reminding her that she's married, but now she's going against the will of God. And though she spoke to him day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even be with her. Now, this is a man that she's trying to victimize, and he's very vulnerable because he has no family, he has no wife, his brothers have sold him into slavery. You know, the average person would say, forget it. I might as well take what I can get and run. And he's not. He's saying, no, I'm not compromising myself. One day he went into the house to attend to his duties, and none of the household servants was inside. Well, she might have made sure that she got rid of them. She caught him by his cloak and said, come to bed with me. But he left his cloak in her hands and ran out of the house. Boy, this takes a lot of willpower. I don't know about you, but that's an awful big temptation. When she saw that he had left his cloak in her hands and had ran out of the house, which really made a fool of her, she called her household servants. Look, she said to them, this Hebrew, has been brought to us to make sport of us. He came in to sleep with me, but I screamed. And when he heard my screams for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house. Now, I don't know if any of these servants believed her, I'm sure that they understood what she was about. You can read, stuff in people's personality just being around them. But what could they do? They were servants too, She kept his cloak beside her until the master came home. Then she told him this story. The Hebrew slave you brought us came to me to make sport of me, but as soon as I screamed for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house. Well, so now she's going to lie about it. When his master heard this story, his wife told him, saying, this is how your slave treated me. He burned with anger. Well, it's hard to take certain things from our spouses. And if we're a protector of our spouses, we can overreact. And maybe we don't want to face the situation, what we really think happened. But, how are you going to take a Hebrew slave over your wife? So there's a lot of implications here. Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. But while Joseph was there in the prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So now people will be able to begin to recognize talent. Too bad they don't also recognize integrity. They use talent. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in the prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. Well, you see, when you have integrity, you wait on the Lord. When you don't have integrity, you try to fix your own problems, and you don't wait for God's favor. Now, this is the interesting part. His brothers got him to Egypt. Potiphar's wife, sinning against him, got him to prison. And you're going to see what's going to happen because he was in prison. This is the story about other prisoners now. Joseph is kind of in charge. Chapter 40, if you're following me in your Bible. Sometime later, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt offended the master, the king of Egypt, which is Pharaoh. Pharaoh was angry with the two officers, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and he put them in the custody of the house of the captain of the guard, that was Potiphar, in the same prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard assigned them to Joseph, and he attended to them. Now, these people were like cabinet members. What did these two people do? Well, one of the things that the baker did, he prepared the food. Okay? So he had to be trusted, because if you wanted to assassinate him, in those days they would poison the king. And what was the cupbearer to do? Well, he was to test the drink. So if somebody tried to kill Pharaoh and I drank his cup first, I'd be killed and not Pharaoh. If I looked like it didn't bother me, then it was all right for me to drink from that wine. So it was an important job. Maybe they thought there was a conspiracy. I don't know. But anyway, listen what happens. After they had been in the custody for some time, each of the two men, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who was being held in prison, had a dream the same night, and each dream had a meaning of its own. When Joseph came to them the next morning, he saw that they were dejected. So he asked Pharaoh's officers, who were in custody with him in the master's house, "What is your face so sad today?" Well, you know, when you're in deep thought, your body language expresses your inner heart. "We both had dreams," they answered, "but there's no one here to interpret it." Now, the magicians and all of these cult practice people, they would be the ones that you normally went for an interpretation, but they hung out in the palace. They didn't hang out in the prison. Okay? Then Joseph said to him, "Do not interpretation belong to God? Tell me your dream." So he's saying that it's not, the magicians that should be interpreted. God interprets dreams. God will reveal the truth to you. And as an agent of God, he realized he could be used to help these men out. See, he's not doing it for selfish reasons. He's doing it for their sake. Okay? They're fellow prisoners, all three of them. Then Joseph said to them, "Does not interpretation belong to God? Tell me your dream." Okay? We have to be careful when we interpret people's dreams. So the chief cupbearer told Joseph his dream. He said to him, "In my dream I saw a vine in front of me, and on the vine was 3 branches." The word 3 comes up all the time in the Bible. Very significant. As soon as it blossomed and bloomed, and its clusters ripened into grapes, Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes, squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and put the cup into Pharaoh's hand. Well, here comes Joseph now. "This is what it means," Joseph said to them. "In 3 days, the 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore to you your position, and you will be put in Pharaoh's cup in his hand, just as you used to do when you were a cupbearer." He's saying, you're downcasted today. 3 days from now, when Pharaoh calls you and restores you, you're going to be lifted up. "But when all goes well with you, remember me and show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison, for I was forcefully carried off from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I have done nothing to deserve being put in this dungeon." So this was not a nice place. If you've ever been to a dungeon like in England, they're horrible places. Okay? When the chief baker saw that Joseph had given a favoring interpretation, he said to Joseph, "I too had a dream. On my head was 3 baskets of bread. In the top one was all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh. But the birds were eating them out of the basket on my head." "This is what it means," Joseph said. "The 3 baskets are 3 days." Here we go again. "Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head and hang you on a tree. This is like a crucifixion. And the birds will eat away your flesh. Now, 3 days was Pharaoh's birthday, and he gave a feast for all his officers. He lifted up the head of the chief cupbearer and the chief baker in his presence of his officers. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position so that he once again put the cup in Pharaoh's hand. He was fully restored. But he hung the chief baker, just as Joseph had said to them in his interpretation. It's important to be around men of God. You know, in the Christian world, they believe in the gift of prophecy like the Old Testament. The prophet was given the message by God for the people. In the Old Testament, you know, Moses was a prophet. He told the people. You don't always have to tell the people the future. Sometimes it's instructions. Prophets all the time had to correct kings. The chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. Now, what happens? Well, here's an interesting story in 41. Pharaoh has a dream. Now, this is 2 years later. So 2 years later, when 2 years had passed, Pharaoh had a dream. He was standing at the Nile when out of the river there came 7 cows, okay? Number of completion. She and fat. And they grazed among the reeds. After them, 7 other cows, ugly, came up out of the Nile and stood beside those on the riverbank. And the cows that were ugly ate up the 7, okay? And Pharaoh woke up. He fell asleep again and had a second dream. 7 heads of grain, healthy and good, were growing on a single stalk. After that, 7 other heads of grain, scrawny, thin, shrunk by the east wind. East wind, I believe, came out of the desert, so you can understand what that's about. Robs the plant of moisture. The thin heads of the grain swallowed up the 7 healthy heads. Then Pharaoh woke up, and he had been dreaming. In the morning, his mind was troubled, same as the prisoners, right? So he sent for all the magicians and the wise men of Egypt. Pharaoh told them his dream, but no one could interpret them for him. Well, at least they didn't make up a story. And you know, when you make up a story, most people don't believe it anyway. Somehow or another, they're looking for truth. Then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, "Today I remember my shortcomings." Pharaoh was angry with his servant, and he imprisoned me and the chief baker in the house of the captain of the guard. Each of us had a dream the same night, and each dream had a meaning of its own. Now a young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. We told him our dream, and he interpreted them for us, gave each man an interpretation of the dream. And the things turned out exactly as the interpretation that he gave them. Well, we know that was true. I was restored to my position, and the other men was hung. Now you got to realize Pharaoh's listening to this, and he knows exactly this happened 2 years earlier. He remembers putting him in prison. He remembers taking him out. He remembers executing one. and this man is still serving him alongside. So Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and he was quickly brought from the dungeons, where he had been shaven and change of clothes, and came before Pharaoh. You don't go before royalty the way you are. There is a dress code. And you know, maybe as a Hebrew, he had a beard. Probably had to shave it off, because the Egyptians were probably clean shaven. So sometimes when you're in Rome, you got to do as the Romans do. So you don't allow your presentation or your appearance to take away from what you got to say, especially when you're representing God. Okay? Pharaoh said to Joseph, I had a dream, and no one can interpret it, but I have heard it said that you, when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. Now listen to Joseph's remark. This is a man who's been sold into slavery, has been falsely accused, has spent years in prison, and, you know, he doesn't say, oh yeah, I'm the man. He says, I can't do it, Joseph replied to Pharaoh. But God will give Pharaoh the answer he deserves. What a humble way to present it to the king. You know, he's looking to get out of jail, but he's giving God the credit. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, in my dream, I stood on the banks of the Nile, when out of the river came up 7 cows, fat, lean, and gazed among the reeds. After that, 7 other cows came up. And then he talks about the scrawny and the very ugly and lean. And I never seen such ugly cows in the land of Egypt. Okay? The lean, ugly cows ate up the 7 fat cows that came up first. But even after they ate them, didn't do them any good. Okay? They looked just as ugly, he says. Then he goes on, he says, in my dream I saw 7 heads of grain, full and good and growing on a single stalk. After that, 7 other heads sprouted, you know, withered, thin, scrawny by the east wind. The thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 good heads. It took, the magicians could not do anything to explain it to me. So he tells him that. Now Joseph says to Pharaoh, the dream of Pharaoh are one and the same. God obviously repeated himself because it was important. God had revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. 7 good cows are the 7 years, and the 7 good heads of grain are 7 years. It is one and the same dream. The 7 lean and ugly cows that came up afterwards are 7 years. So are the 7 worthless heads of grain swallowed, scorned by the east wind. They are 7 years of famine. It is just as I said to Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. 7 years of great abundances are coming upon the land of Egypt. But 7 years of famine will follow them. Then all the abundance of Egypt will be forgotten, and the famine will ranch the land. The abundance in the land will not be remembered, because the famine that follows will be so severe. The reason the dream was given to Pharaoh in 2 folds is that the matter has been firmly declared by God, and God will do it soon. Well, listen to this, what Pharaoh's reaction is as we wrap up today. And now let Pharaoh look for a discerning man and wise man and put him in charge of the land of Egypt. He doesn't say, give me the job. Pharaoh appoint a commissioner over the land to take 1/5 of the harvest of Egypt during the 7 years of abundancy. They should collect all the food of their good years and are coming and store up the grain under the authority of Pharaoh to be given and kept in the city for food. So he decentralizes it. This food should be held in reserve for the country to be used during the 7 years of famine that will come upon Egypt, so that the country may not be ravaged by the famine. The plan seemed good to Pharaoh and to all his officers. So Pharaoh answered them, "Can we find anyone like this man, one in who is the Spirit of God?" Very important. Okay? Then Pharaoh says to Joseph, "Since God has made all this known to you," Pharaoh's talking about God, right? "There is no one so distinguished and wise as you. You will be in charge of my palace, and all the people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you." Great story. Are you having trouble? Hang in there. God has an answer. You're being prevented from doing what you're supposed to do? Be patient. Listen, come back next week. Look at our website for last week's show if you haven't seen it, at thefutureofisrael.org. Or write to me, please, at info@thefutureofisrael.org. We're going to study what happens now that Joseph is put in charge once and for all, and raised up to, I would call it like a prime minister. And here he was, a Hebrew slave. And Pharaoh says, "There's nobody that I know that matches this young man. He's going to save us." So trust God for your outcome. Call on God in your needs. And listen, be back next week. See how this story ends. The rest of the book of Genesis is all about Joseph. He is the Redeemer. And watch what happens to his family as well. Once and for all, we need to internalize the history of the Israeli people to know what God's doing with them. Shalom. Have a good evening.